In that moment, Olivia felt the final pieces of her new identity clicking into place, not running from her father's legacy nor trapped by it, but extending it in ways uniquely her own. Later that evening, as Olivia packed her equipment in preparation for returning to Highland Archers, she found a quiet moment to visit the now empty competition field. Standing at the shooting line where Mia had won her championship hours earlier, Olivia allowed herself to fully embrace the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 years ago, devastated by her father's death, she had fled from the archery world, seeking anonymity as a shield against grief and expectations. The equipment technician role at Highland had been a compromise close enough to the sport. She loved to be bearable, far enough from the spotlight to feel safe. Then came the regional championships, the revelation of her identity, and the discovery that sharing her knowledge brought a satisfaction deeper than any medal. Now she stood on the threshold of rejoining the international archery community. Not as a competitor, but as a technical innovator, someone who could help archers maximize their potential through understanding the complex interplay of equipment, conditions, and execution. It wasn't the path anyone had expected for Thomas Parker's daughter, not the archery community, not her father's colleagues, not even Olivia herself. But standing there in the quiet of the empty arena, she knew with absolute certainty that it was the right path for her. Olivia drew her father's Olympic bow from its case, feeling its familiar weight and balance as an old friend rather than a burden. She nocked an arrow, drew to anchor, and released with the perfect form that had once made her a world-class competitor. The arrow struck dead center in the distant target, a shot that once would have been about proving herself, but now was simply an expression of harmony with the sport she had rediscovered on her own terms. "They used to call me Equipment Girl," she said softly to the empty field, "until I made the impossible shot, not with an arrow, but with my life." As Olivia lowered the bow, she felt a profound sense of peace. The journey wasn't over, the World Cup awaited, and beyond that, possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. But the direction was clear now, the path illuminated by understanding rather than expectation. Thomas Parker's daughter had found her way back to archery, not by following in his footsteps, but by charting her own course through the landscape he had helped her learn to navigate. The equipment girl had become a technical innovator, a mentor, a guardian of wisdom worth preserving. Not a replica of her father, but a continuation of what mattered most about his legacy, the deep understanding of archery as both science and art, precision and intuition, technique and adaptation. It was enough, more than enough. It was exactly right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The day Eliza Morgan defied direct orders at Horizon Base, she transformed from a rule-following analyst to the hero no one saw coming. Her modest credentials and unassuming presence had made her invisible to the commanders and specialists who ran the prestigious research facility. But beneath her quiet exterior lay abilities that would change everything when disaster struck. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eliza stepped through the reinforced glass doors of Horizon Base's main laboratory complex with purposeful strides. Her identification badge displayed her name and position: Environmental Systems Analyst. Level 2 clearance in simple black text that practically screamed, "Non-essential personnel." The sprawling research center hummed with energy as scientists, military personnel, and technology specialists moved with practiced confidence between workstations filled with cutting-edge equipment. She adjusted her standard-issue gray uniform, the kind given to support staff who were expected to blend into the background. Around her, senior researchers wore custom lab coats emblazoned with departmental insignias and achievement patches. Security officers moved with the self-assured bearing of people who knew exactly where they belonged and what their purpose was. Eliza had been working at Horizon Base for 4 years now, analyzing atmospheric irregularities and environmental patterns around the facility. It was steady work that used her scientific training while keeping her connected to the world of advanced research she had once been more actively involved in. Her invitation to today's demonstration had come through her department head. She was to observe and document environmental readings during the test of the new atmospheric stabilization system, nothing more. She paused near one of the monitoring stations, her trained eye catching something concerning in the data stream. The pressure readings in the atmospheric chamber showed subtle fluctuations that didn't match the expected patterns. "There's an inconsistency in the pressure stabilization sequence," she said quietly to the technician monitoring the station. "Those variations will compound exponentially when the system goes to full capacity." The technician, a confident young man named Jason, looked up with barely concealed impatience. "Thanks for your concern. We'll add it to the notes for the junior staff to review." His tone carried that special kind of dismissive politeness reserved for people who clearly didn't understand the sophisticated systems they were commenting on. A few senior researchers nearby exchanged amused glances. One of them, Dr. Harrington, a senior physicist with an impressive array of credentials displayed on his lab coat, smiled condescendingly. "The environmental monitoring team is stationed on level 3. This section is for primary systems analysts only." Eliza felt the familiar weight of assumptions settling around her, the quiet analyst with the basic clearance badge. The one who should stick to her assigned tasks and not question the work of specialists with more impressive titles. Someone nearby took a photo of the test setup, probably for the project documentation. Another began recording the system outputs, pointedly turning away from her as if to avoid capturing her in the footage. She did neither of the things they expected. She didn't apologize for speaking up, nor did she respond with frustration. Eliza simply nodded, her expression unreadable, and moved along the line of monitoring stations. Behind her, the pressure readings continued to fluctuate, the same inconsistency she'd identified, becoming more pronounced. No one else noticed. The dismissal stung, but it wasn't unexpected. In her 4 years of analytical work, Eliza had grown accustomed to being the observer rather than the decision-maker. The analyst who was invited to collect data, but never to interpret it or suggest improvements. The woman with the technical knowledge, but without the credentials that commanded immediate respect. What they didn't know, what her modest clearance, badge and standard uniform couldn't tell them, was that 7 years ago, she had been leading emergency response teams during atmospheric crises that made today's controlled tests look like simple science projects. She had developed protocols for stabilizing atmospheric disturbances that were now standard procedure throughout the scientific community. Protocols that were being implemented in today's demonstration, though few people in the room knew their origin. But that was before her name had been removed from the official documentation, before her contributions had been classified and attributed to the collective research team, before she'd been quietly reassigned to an analytical position that eventually became a monitoring role with limited input privileges. Now she was just Eliza, the quiet one, the observer, the analyst who should stick to her assigned tasks. As she walked toward the observation deck that circled the main testing chamber, she pulled out her personal tablet and reviewed the morning's test parameters. Something about the scheduled demonstration had been bothering her since she arrived. Pattern in the system configurations that reminded her of a failed test she'd witnessed years ago. The cool air from the environmental control systems raised goosebumps on her arms as she found a quiet spot near the railing. From here, she could see the massive atmospheric stabilization chamber where the demonstration would soon take place. The chamber sat silent and ready, its reinforced walls designed to contain the artificial weather systems that would be generated during the test. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eliza had worked with similar technology once, smaller, less refined, but based on the same principles. That project hadn't ended with applause and congratulations, but with a rapidly developing atmospheric disturbance that command had hesitated to address until it was almost too late. She hadn't hesitated then. Her quick thinking and willingness to bypass standard protocols had prevented a catastrophe. Her hand unconsciously moved to the inner pocket of her uniform where she kept a small medallion, a token of recognition from her old research team. The engraving had worn smooth from years of habitual touching, the raised letters and symbols. Now barely discernible, no one asked about it anymore. She'd stopped telling the story, but today something felt different. The pressure inconsistencies she'd spotted weren't random. The system configuration wasn't following standard safety protocols, and the feeling building in her chest, the same instinct that had guided her through countless crisis scenarios, was telling her that this demonstration was about to become something more dangerous than anyone anticipated. Eliza checked her watch. The demonstration would begin in 2 hours. She had time to observe, to analyze, to understand what was really happening here. She had time to be the quiet analyst they expected her to be. Unless, of course, being quiet was no longer an option. As she walked back toward the main testing area, the ventilation systems hummed to life, circulating air through the facility with increasing intensity. The real demonstration was about to begin, and Eliza Morgan, the woman they'd dismissed as just another analyst, was about to discover that some patterns never changed, no matter how much time passed or how far you tried to run from who you used to be. The question was, when the moment came, would she choose to follow orders and stay silent, or would she remember what it felt like to break the rules for the right reasons? The control center above the main testing chamber buzzed with anticipation as final preparations for the atmospheric stabilization demonstration got underway. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the massive chamber below, while multiple display screens showed real-time data feeds and system diagnostics. Representatives from government agencies and private research institutions stood shoulder to shoulder, their conversations a mix of scientific jargon and barely concealed competition. Eliza positioned herself near the back wall, half hidden by the documentation team that had clustered around the main presentation area. She kept her tablet discreet, taking notes that looked routine but were anything but. The morning's system diagnostics had shown concerning patterns, but nothing in the official briefing had acknowledged the risks she could clearly see developing. Dr. Harrington, the physicist who had dismissed her earlier, had apparently been designated as the lead presenter. He stood at the central console, his voice confident and commanding as he launched into the technical overview. The atmospheric stabilization project represents the culmination of 5 years of research and development, he announced to the assembled observers. Today's demonstration will showcase our ability to neutralize severe weather patterns in a controlled environment, with implications for climate management on a global scale. Beside him, the project's senior engineer, Dr. Kamala Patel, tapped at a glowing terminal, adjusting system parameters while several government officials leaned in to observe the process. On the main screen, a real-time simulation showed the expected progression of the demonstration. A small-scale weather system would be generated, intensified, and then systematically neutralized using the new technology. But Eliza's trained. I caught something else. The power distribution to the stabilization field generators showed subtle imbalances, not dramatic, but familiar. She'd seen this pattern before, in a classified incident that had been buried so deep that even she wasn't supposed to remember it. That power distribution, she said quietly, pointing to the upper section of the display. It's creating harmonic interference patterns in the stabilization field. Dr. Harrington turned toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's a standard fluctuation pattern. You'll see it any time we're initializing the field generators. He didn't wait for a reply, turning back to his presentation with the kind of dismissive efficiency that suggested Eliza had already been forgotten. Dr. Patel gave a casual shrug. We developed these systems from the ground up. If something was wrong, we'd be the first to know. I've seen this pattern before, Eliza pressed, her voice still low but carrying a note of urgency. That harmonic interference will amplify exponentially once the atmospheric conditions intensify. A small pause followed, filled with the kind of awkward silence that comes when someone refuses to take a hint. Then Jason, the technician from earlier, chuckled from his position at a nearby console. Still finding problems where none exist. Maybe stick to environmental readings and leave the atmospheric physics to the experts. A few people nearby laughed, not cruelly, exactly, but dismissively. One of the government representatives raised his phone to take a casual picture of the control center, probably for his presentation back at headquarters. Another whispered something to his colleague that made them both smirk. Eliza felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to stay focused on the display. The power distribution was still wrong. The harmonics were still building up, and no one was doing anything about it. Could I see the raw field data? She asked, keeping her voice steady. Dr. Harrington's smile became more strained. You're not cleared for that level of analysis. This is a demonstration, not a collaborative review session. Jason muttered something about analysts who think they've spotted Nobel Prize-worthy discoveries, which earned another round of chuckles from nearby staff. Someone had been recording the presentation, and Eliza could see several phones pointed in her direction, capturing her persistent questions and the dismissive responses. The humiliation was complete when a young intern approached with refreshments, then hesitated as she reached Eliza. Sorry, these are for the demonstration team only. The smile that accompanied the words was polite, but the message was clear. Know your place. Eliza stepped back from the group, her face burning. Around her, the presentation continued as if nothing had happened. Dr. Harrington adjusted the display settings. Dr. Patel fine-tuned the controls, and the crowd of observers continued their casual networking. But on the main screen, the power harmonics were still building in ways that defied the system's safety parameters. The demonstration was proceeding according to a flawed plan, and no one was seeing the danger that was becoming increasingly obvious to her trained eye. Eliza pulled out her tablet and began documenting everything she could see: power fluctuations, harmonic patterns, the specific way the stabilization field wavered after each adjustment. If no one else was going to take this seriously, she'd create a record that couldn't be dismissed later when questions were asked about what went wrong. Outside the control center windows, a technician was working on one of the atmospheric sensors, his movements becoming increasingly agitated as he checked and rechecked readings that didn't match expectations. He paused in his work and looked up at the testing chamber with sudden concern. Eliza followed his gaze and saw a swirling pattern forming within the chamber, moving too quickly and with too much intensity for this early stage of the demonstration. What's happening with the atmospheric density? Someone in the crowd asked, pointing toward the chamber. The observation windows provided a clear view of the testing area, and now everyone could see the rapidly intensifying weather pattern taking shape. Is that part of the demonstration schedule? Another voice asked, uncertainty creeping into the tone. Then a shout from one of the monitoring stations. Power surge in the stabilization grid. Field integrity compromised. The change in the room was immediate and electric. Phones flew up to capture the unexpected development. Chairs scraped against the floor as people moved closer to the windows, and the casual networking atmosphere evaporated in an instant. Dr. Harrington froze at his console, his polished presentation. Forgotten. Dr. Patel stared at the screen as the stabilization field readings suddenly fluctuated wildly. No stable patterns, no controlled progression, just rapidly escalating chaos. "We're losing containment on the eastern quadrant," came a voice from one of the monitoring stations. "Stabilization field is not responding to adjustments." The control room erupted into controlled chaos. Guests backed toward the exit. Officials demanded explanations, and the carefully orchestrated demonstration dissolved into confusion and growing concern. Eliza stood perfectly still in the middle of it all, watching the atmospheric chamber through the windows. She could see the progression of the destabilization, the speed and pattern of the intensification that matched her worst fears. This wasn't a minor system error or a temporary fluctuation. The harmonic interference she'd identified earlier had cascaded into a full system failure, and the artificial weather system was now developing beyond the parameters of the containment field. "This isn't a demonstration anymore," she said aloud, though her voice was lost in the commotion around her. She'd tried to warn them. She'd tried to make them listen, but they dismissed her as just another analyst, another quiet observer who didn't understand the complexity of what she was seeing. Now, as alarms began to sound and the reality of the situation settled over the control room like a physical weight, Eliza realized that her years of quiet observation were about to end. The pattern she'd recognized, the instincts that had guided her through countless crisis situations, were telling her exactly what was happening and exactly what needed to be done. The question was, would anyone listen to her now, or would she have to find another way to prevent a disaster that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control? The chaos in the control room had reached a fever pitch. Red warning lights bathed the space in an ominous glow as personnel scrambled between monitoring stations, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of confusion and growing alarm. The atmospheric disturbance within the testing chamber was intensifying rapidly, swirling patterns of energy threatening to breach the containment field that separated the controlled environment from the rest of the facility. Eliza watched the pandemonium unfold around her with mounting frustration. She had tried to warn them about the harmonic interference, tried to point out the power fluctuations that suggested the stabilization field was compromised, but her concerns had been dismissed, her expertise questioned, her very presence treated as an unwelcome intrusion. Now, as scientists rushed to stabilize the deteriorating conditions, and technicians worked frantically to reinforce the containment field, Eliza felt the familiar weight of being invisible in a room full of people who should have been listening. "Control Center to Director Walsh." Dr. Harrington's voice crackled over the communication system, his earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "We need immediate authorization for emergency shutdown protocols. The atmospheric system is not responding to standard containment procedures." The response came back tense and clipped, negative on full shutdown. The damage to the system would be catastrophic. "Implement Stage 3 stabilization measures and stand by." "Director, with all due respect," Dr. Patel interjected. "Stage 3 measures are insufficient for the current levels of instability. We need to follow established protocols," came the firm reply. "We cannot risk a complete system failure. The research is too valuable." Eliza felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew this pattern. The hesitation, the by-the-book responses, the careful adherence to protocol while a real threat grew exponentially. It was exactly what had happened 7 years ago during the incident that had ended her career as a lead researcher. Then, as now, command had hesitated while she had acted. The atmospheric disturbance was now clearly visible through the reinforced windows of the control center. A swirling vortex of energy and matter, moving with increasing intensity within the testing chamber. Eliza studied its patterns, its rate of expansion, the way it seemed to concentrate its energy against the weakest points of the containment. Field. Every detail confirmed what she'd suspected from the moment she'd seen those power harmonics. This wasn't just a demonstration gone wrong. It was a replay of something that had happened before, during a classified experiment that had been buried so deep that even she wasn't supposed to remember it. The harmonic interference pattern, she said, stepping closer to the main display. I've seen this before. It's following the same cascade failure as, "Ma'am, please step back from the console," interrupted a security officer, his hand moving to rest on her arm. "This area is restricted during emergency protocols." Eliza looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had dismissed her just hours earlier. Dr. Harrington, pale and tense as he struggled to maintain control of a situation that was clearly beyond his understanding. Dr. Patel frantically adjusting parameters on systems that were no longer responding to standard commands. Jason, the technician who had mocked her, now staring at readings he couldn't interpret, his confident demeanor replaced by growing fear. They were all experts in their fields, professionals with years of experience and clearances that far exceeded her own. But none of them had faced a situation like this before. None of them had neutralized a cascade failure using techniques that didn't exist in any official manual. "The stabilization field isn't failing," she said, her voice cutting through the noise in the room. "It's being overwhelmed by the harmonic interference. Someone needs to implement a counter-resonance pattern to disrupt the energy cycle." Dr. Harrington turned from his console, his face flushed with stress and anger. "I told you to stay back. We don't need theories right now. We need solutions." "I'm giving you a solution," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "You have a fully equipped atmospheric control system. You have someone who knows how to handle this situation. But instead of listening, you're following protocols that were never designed for this kind of cascade failure. What would you know about atmospheric stabilization?" Jason demanded, his voice dripping with condescension despite the fear in his eyes. "You're an environmental analyst. You monitor external readings and file reports." Eliza felt something break inside her. Not anger, but a kind of cold clarity that she hadn't experienced in years. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small medallion she'd carried for over 7 years. It was a researcher's achievement token, tarnished with age but still recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. 7 years ago, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made the room fall silent, I led the emergency response to a harmonic cascade failure at the Northfield Research Station. It was displaying the same interference patterns as your system, the same power fluctuations, the same exponential growth. Command hesitated, just like you're hesitating now. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who were finally, truly seeing her for the first time. I didn't hesitate. I developed a counter-resonance technique using recursive field generators and energy dissipation arrays. I stabilized that atmospheric disturbance without evacuating the facility, without losing a single piece of research data, without anyone getting hurt. The room was completely silent now, the weight of her words settling over the chaos like a blanket. Outside the windows, the atmospheric disturbance continued to grow, and somewhere beneath them, the power system strained to maintain the failing containment field. And then Command classified the entire incident, buried the technique I developed, and quietly transferred me to an analytical position because I had broken protocols to save everyone in that facility. Dr. Patel's face had gone pale. That's not possible. There's no record of any technique called. Of course there's no record, Eliza interrupted. Just like there's no record of the cascade failure at Northfield. Just like there's no record of the researcher who saved an entire facility from atmospheric collapse. That's what classification means. It erases inconvenient truths. She looked toward the testing chamber where the artificial weather system continued to intensify, pushing against the weakening containment field with increasing force. For 4 years, she'd accepted her role as a support analyst, content to monitor data and file reports while others made the decisions that mattered. But the pattern was repeating itself. The same hesitation, the same adherence to protocol, while real people faced real danger. And this time, she wasn't going to sit quietly while command figured out what to do. "I can stop this," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced this exact situation before. "I can stabilize that atmospheric disturbance and save your research data, but I need access to the primary control systems, and I need it now." The security officer's grip tightened on her arm. "Ma'am, you're not authorized to. None of you are authorized to handle this situation," Eliza said, her voice cutting through the objection. "Your protocols weren't designed for harmonic cascade failures. Your researchers weren't trained for counter-resonance techniques. Your entire response structure is built around threats that follow predictable patterns." She gestured toward the window where the atmospheric disturbance was now clearly visible as a swirling vortex of energy and matter. "That thing in there doesn't follow predictable patterns. It's operating on principles that your systems can't compensate for and your procedures can't counter. You can stand here and follow protocol while it breaches containment, or you can let someone who has actually faced this before do what needs to be done." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant wail of alarms. Everyone was looking at her now, not as a dismissed analyst or a quiet observer, but as someone who might actually have the answers they desperately needed. Dr. Patel's voice came out, barely above a whisper. "How do we know you're telling me truth?" Eliza smiled, and for the first time in 4 years, it felt genuine. "Because in about 45 seconds, that disturbance is going to shift from a circular pattern to a hexagonal structure. It will concentrate its energy at the 6 points of that structure and begin pulsing in a rhythmic sequence. It's following the same cascade protocol as the disturbance I neutralized 7 years ago." She checked her watch. 40 seconds. Every eye in the room turned toward the testing chamber. Outside, the atmospheric disturbance continued its circular motion, showing no signs of the predicted transformation. 30 seconds, Eliza said calmly. The seconds ticked by in absolute silence. Then, exactly as she had predicted, the swirling vortex shifted, transforming from a circular pattern into a distinct hexagonal structure. Energy began to concentrate at the 6 points of the hexagon, pulsing in a rhythmic sequence that made the containment field fluctuate dangerously. The room erupted in startled voices and urgent commands, but Eliza was already moving, pushing past the security officer and heading for the primary control console. "Where are you going?" Dr. Harrington called after her. Eliza paused at the main terminal and looked back at the room full of people who had finally, reluctantly, begun to listen. "To break some rules and save your lives." The ventilation systems in the control room hummed with increased intensity as Eliza Morgan positioned herself at the primary control terminal. Her movements were precise and efficient, years of muscle memory returning as her fingers flew across the interface with practiced confidence. Around her, the room had fallen into an uneasy silence, the earlier chaos replaced by wary observation as scientists, technicians, and officials watched her work. The hexagonal atmospheric disturbance pulsed with increasing power behind the reinforced glass, each rhythmic surge sending vibrations through the floor of the control center. The containment field flickered dangerously with each pulse, the energy barriers designed to contain the artificial weather system pushed to their limits. "What exactly are you doing?" Dr. Harrington asked, his voice carrying both skepticism and desperate hope as he hovered at her shoulder. "Implementing a counter-resonance pattern," Eliza replied without looking up, her attention fixed on the rapidly changing data streams. "Standard stabilization protocols treat the atmospheric disturbance as a unified system. That's why they're failing." Her hands moved confidently across the interface, accessing system components that most of the observation team didn't even know existed. Years as a support analyst had given her intimate knowledge of Horizon Base's systems, knowledge that now proved invaluable as she bypassed security protocols and reconfigured power distribution networks. The key is to recognize that the disturbance isn't a single entity, but a composite of multiple resonance patterns. She continued, her voice calm despite the urgency of her actions. Each point of the hexagon operates on its own frequency. Neutralize those individual frequencies, and the entire structure collapses. Dr. Patel leaned closer, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by professional curiosity. But the system isn't designed to target individual frequency patterns. The stabilization field operates on broadband principles. Eliza allowed herself a brief smile, which is precisely why your protocols aren't working. The broad approach amplifies the harmonic interference instead of neutralizing it. We need precision, not power. She pulled up a secondary command interface and began coding a new algorithm directly into the system. What she was doing violated at least 7 different operational protocols, each override requiring her to consciously disregard regulations she had followed without question for the past 4 years. "This is completely unauthorized," the facility's security chief said, stepping forward with a tablet displaying the active security breaches her actions were triggering. "You're overriding safety protocols that exist for very good reasons." "Those protocols were designed for predictable situations," Eliza replied without pausing her work. "This isn't one of them." On the main display, warning messages flashed as the system registered her unauthorized access. Under normal circumstances, such actions would result in immediate removal from the facility and potential criminal charges. But as the atmospheric disturbance grew more intense, protocol had become a luxury they could no longer afford. "Director Walsh needs to be informed," the security chief insisted, reaching for the communication console. Eliza's hand shot out, catching his wrist before he could activate the link. "There's no time for approval chains. Every second we delay increases the risk of complete containment failure." She turned to face the room, her eyes meeting each person's gaze with calm intensity. "I understand the position I'm putting each of you in. I'm breaking rules that we've all been trained to follow without question. If this goes wrong, I'll take full responsibility." Her fingers returned to the interface, continuing their precise dance across the controls. "But if we wait for proper authorization, there won't be anything left to take responsibility for." The hexagonal disturbance pulsed again, stronger this time. The reinforced glass of the observation windows vibrated visibly, and several monitoring stations registered critical warnings as the containment field's integrity dropped to dangerous levels. "She's right," Dr. Patel said suddenly, moving to a secondary control station. "We don't have time for standard procedures. What do you need from us?" Eliza felt a surge of gratitude for the scientist's support. "I need direct access to the field generator controls and power distribution grid. And someone needs to evacuate all non-essential personnel from the lower levels. If the containment field fails completely, we'll need to implement facility-wide emergency protocols." The security chief hesitated, torn between adherence to protocol and the obvious danger of the situation. Finally, he nodded grimly. "I'll coordinate the evacuation. But this is all going on the record." "Put it on whatever record you want," Eliza replied, already turning back to her work. "Just get those people to safety." As the security team began implementing evacuation procedures, Eliza continued reconfiguring the atmospheric control systems. On her screen, she could see the complex energy patterns of the disturbance, each point of the hexagon pulsing with its own unique frequency signature. Standard protocols treated these as random fluctuations, but Eliza recognized them as a predictable sequence, one she had documented 7 years ago during the Northfield incident. "Dr. Patel, I need you to redirect power from the main grid to the secondary field generators," she called across the increasingly empty control room. We're going to create a targeted counter frequency for each point of the hexagon. The senior engineer nodded, her hands moving across her own terminal with professional efficiency. Redirecting power now. But the secondary generators weren't designed for this kind of precision targeting. They might not hold. They'll hold, Eliza said with quiet confidence. Because we're not going to brute force this. We're going to use the disturbance's own energy against it. As she spoke, her fingers implemented the final elements of her counter-resonance algorithm. What she was attempting had never been officially tested or approved. It existed only in her memory and in classified files that she wasn't supposed to know about, but it had worked once. It had saved lives and prevented a catastrophic breach, and if her analysis was correct, it would work again. She adjusted the final parameters and took a deep breath. Counter-resonance sequence initiating in 3, 2, 1. The effect was immediate and dramatic. 6 precisely calibrated energy pulses shot from the secondary field generators, each targeting a specific point of the hexagonal disturbance. The pulses didn't attempt to contain or suppress the atmospheric anomaly. Instead, they matched its frequencies exactly, creating a perfect harmonic reflection. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The disturbance continued its rhythmic pulsing, apparently unaffected by the intervention. Then, gradually, the pattern began to change. The hexagon's perfect structure wavered as the counter-resonance pulses disrupted its internal harmony. "It's working," Dr. Patel whispered, her eyes fixed on the monitoring displays where energy readings were beginning to stabilize. "The harmonic interference is breaking down." Eliza didn't respond, her attention completely focused on adjusting the counter-resonance frequencies to match the disturbance's evolving patterns. This was the most critical phase, the moment when the atmospheric anomaly would either collapse under its own disrupted harmonics or adapt to overcome their intervention. The control room had fallen completely silent, every remaining person holding their breath as they watched the battle of energies playing out before them. Even Dr. Harrington, who had been so dismissive of Eliza's warnings earlier, stood transfixed by the precision of her work. Sweat beaded on Eliza's forehead as she made micro-adjustments to the counter-resonance pattern, compensating for the disturbance's attempts to stabilize itself. This was the part that couldn't be programmed or automated. It required intuitive understanding of atmospheric behaviors, the kind of knowledge that came only from direct experience. "Power fluctuations in the secondary generators," Dr. Patel reported, her voice tense. "They're reaching capacity limits." "Reroute auxiliary power from the dormant systems," Eliza replied, not looking up from her work. "We need to maintain the counter-resonance for another 60 seconds. The hexagonal structure was now visibly destabilizing, its perfect angles collapsing into a more chaotic pattern as the counter-resonance pulses disrupted its internal coherence. Energy readings showed decreasing intensity, and the containment field had begun to restabilize as the pressure against it diminished. "It's collapsing," Dr. Harrington said, disbelief evident in his voice. "The disturbance is actually collapsing." Eliza allowed herself a small smile as she watched the atmospheric anomaly begin to fold in on itself, the dangerous energy dispersing into harmless patterns that the standard stabilization systems could easily manage. The counter-resonance technique was working exactly as she had designed it to work 7 years ago, not by fighting against the disturbance's power, but by using its own harmonics to unravel its structure. 30 seconds later, the crisis was over. Where a dangerous atmospheric disturbance had raged just minutes before, now only gentle swirls of energy remained, safely contained within the stabilization field. The emergency alarms fell silent, and the red warning lights gave way to the standard illumination of the control room. Eliza sat back from the terminal, suddenly aware of the exhaustion that came from such intense concentration. Around her, the remaining staff stared in amazement, their earlier skepticism replaced by something that looked very much like respect. "How did you know that would work?" Dr. Patel asked, breaking the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. Eliza's response was interrupted by the control room doors sliding open. Director Walsh strode in, flanked by security personnel, his expression a careful mask of professional concern. "I was informed of an unauthorized emergency protocol implementation," he said, his eyes immediately finding Eliza at the primary terminal. "Would someone care to explain why evacuation procedures were initiated without my direct authorization?" The security chief stepped forward. "Sir, we had a critical situation with the atmospheric disturbance. Standard protocols were ineffective, and Ms. Morgan took it upon herself to override system security and implement unauthorized procedures." Director Walsh finished, his gaze never leaving Eliza. "Is that an accurate assessment of the situation?" The room fell silent again, tension replacing the brief moment of relief that had followed the crisis resolution. Eliza rose slowly from her seat, facing the director with calm dignity. "Yes, sir. That's accurate. I implemented a counter-resonance technique to neutralize the atmospheric disturbance after standard protocols proved ineffective. I take full responsibility for bypassing security measures and acting without authorization." Director Walsh's expression remained unreadable as he surveyed the control room, taking in the now stabilized testing chamber and the readings that showed a complete resolution of the crisis. "And the results of your unauthorized actions?" Dr. Harrington cleared his throat, stepping forward with evident reluctance. "The atmospheric disturbance has been completely neutralized, sir. The containment field is stable, and preliminary readings suggest minimal damage to the research systems." "In other words," Director Walsh said slowly, "Ms. Morgan's unauthorized actions were successful where our approved protocols failed." It wasn't a question, but Dr. Patel answered anyway. "Yes, sir. The counter-resonance technique she implemented was remarkably effective. Without her intervention, we would have experienced a complete containment failure with potentially catastrophic consequences." The director nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention back to Eliza. "Ms. Morgan, my office, immediately. The rest of you, prepare comprehensive reports on this incident. I want to know exactly what happened, why it happened, and how Ms. Morgan knew what to do when none of our senior researchers did." As Eliza followed Director Walsh from the control room, she could feel the weight of every gaze following her. She had broken the rules, violated protocols, and overridden security systems, actions that would normally result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges. But she had also saved the facility from a disaster that standard procedures couldn't handle. She had demonstrated capabilities that none of the senior researchers possessed, implementing techniques that officially didn't exist. The question now was whether that would be enough to overcome the institutional resistance to someone who had proven that sometimes following orders was the most dangerous thing you could do. Director Walsh's office was located in the administrative wing of Horizon Base, separated from the research facilities by a series of security checkpoints. The walk there was conducted in complete silence, neither Eliza nor the director speaking, as they moved through corridors that gradually transitioned from utilitarian research spaces to more refined administrative areas. When they finally reached his office, a spacious room with actual windows overlooking the facility grounds, Director Walsh gestured for Eliza to take a seat across from his desk. He remained standing, moving to look out the window at the research complex spread below them. 7 years ago, he said without preamble, his back still turned to her, a researcher at Northfield Station prevented a catastrophic atmospheric breach by implementing an unauthorized counter-resonance technique. The incident was classified. The technique was buried, and the researcher was reassigned to an analytical position with limited access privileges. Eliza sat perfectly still, her heart racing despite her outward calm. She had never expected Director Walsh to acknowledge the Northfield incident directly. It had been classified beyond the access level of most facility directors. That researcher's name was removed from official records. Walsh continued, and all documentation of the incident was restricted to the highest security clearance levels. But some of us remember Ms. Morgan. Some of us were there. He turned to face her, his expression no longer the carefully neutral mask of authority, but something more complex, a mixture of respect, concern, and what might have been regret. "You were at Northfield," Eliza said quietly, understanding dawning. "You saw what happened." Walsh nodded once. "I was the assistant director. I watched a brilliant atmospheric researcher break every protocol in the book to save 37 lives, including my own. And then I watched as that same researcher was systematically erased from the scientific community because what she had accomplished threatened established power structures and traditional approaches to crisis management." He moved to his desk and sat down, his posture relaxing slightly. "What I didn't expect was to find that same researcher working as a Level 2 analyst in my own facility 7 years later." "My reassignment file doesn't mention Northfield," Eliza said. "It lists my previous position as a systems analyst with limited field experience." "Because that's what the official record was changed to show," Walsh replied. "Your actual experience, your innovations, your crisis response capabilities, all of it buried because it didn't fit neatly into established protocols." He leaned forward, his expression suddenly intense. "The question, Ms. Morgan, is why you didn't tell me who you were when you were transferred to Horizon Base 4 years ago. Why continue the charade of being just another analyst when you knew your capabilities were needed?" Eliza considered her response carefully. The answer wasn't simple, but she owed him the truth. "Because I learned the hard way what happens when you challenge the system directly," she said finally. "At Northfield, I believed that results would speak for themselves, that saving lives and preventing disaster would be enough to justify breaking the rules. I was wrong." She leaned forward slightly, meeting the director's gaze directly. "The system doesn't reward innovation or independent thinking. It rewards compliance. Following orders. Staying within established parameters, even when those parameters are inadequate for the situation at hand." "So you chose to disappear," Walsh said. "To become the quiet analyst who observes, but doesn't intervene." "Until today," Eliza acknowledged. "Until I saw the same pattern developing, the same hesitation from command, the same potential for disaster if someone didn't act." Walsh was silent for a long moment, considering her words. Then he pressed a button on his desk console, and a holographic display appeared between them, showing personnel files and security clearance designations. "Do you know what happens to employees who violate security protocols, override command systems, and implement unauthorized procedures?" he asked, his tone conversational. "They get terminated," Eliza replied calmly. "Their clearances are revoked, and depending on the severity of the violation, they may face criminal charges." "That's the protocol," Walsh agreed. "The rules are very clear on this matter." He tapped the console again, and Eliza's personnel file appeared in the holographic display. It showed her current status, clearance level, and position designation, all the official documentation that defined her role within Horizon Base. "But then, sometimes protocols fail us," Walsh continued, his fingers moving across the console. "With deliberate precision. Sometimes the rules that are supposed to protect us become the very things that put us in danger. And when that happens, we need people who are willing to break those rules for the right reasons." Before Eliza's eyes, her personnel file began to change. Her clearance level shifted from Level 2 to Level 5 senior researcher status. Her position designation transformed from environmental systems analyst to atmospheric crisis response specialist. Years of experience that had been erased from her official record suddenly reappeared, including her work at Northfield Station. "What are you doing?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Correcting a mistake," Walsh replied simply. One that was made 7 years ago and that I've allowed to continue for far too long. He finished his adjustments and closed the holographic display, fixing Eliza with a serious expression. The official report on today's incident will state that you were operating under my direct authorization as part of a specialized crisis response protocol. Your actions will be documented as a textbook implementation of advanced atmospheric stabilization techniques, fully compliant with facility emergency procedures. Eliza stared at him in disbelief. You're falsifying the official record. I'm correcting it, Walsh repeated firmly. Just as I'm correcting your personnel file to reflect your actual experience and capabilities. He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. Ms. Morgan, today you demonstrated exactly what I've always believed, that sometimes following orders is the worst thing a person can do in a crisis situation. That true expertise doesn't always come with the right clearance level or position. Title, that the quiet observers often see things that the rest of us miss. Eliza felt something tighten in her chest, not fear or anxiety, but a kind of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. What exactly are you proposing, Director? I'm proposing that we stop pretending you're just an analyst, Walsh said. I'm proposing that we acknowledge your expertise, implement your techniques, and create a position that allows you to do what you do best: identify patterns that others miss, and act decisively when standard protocols fail. He pushed a tablet across the desk toward her. On it was a detailed proposal for a new division within Horizon Base Atmospheric Crisis Response and Prevention, with Eliza Morgan listed as the division head. The rules exist for a reason, Ms. Morgan, Walsh said as she scanned the document with growing amazement. Structure, protocol, chain of command. They provide the framework that allows complex organizations to function. But they also create blind spots, institutional biases that can prevent us from seeing genuine threats until it's too late. He gestured toward the window, where the research complex continued its normal operations, the crisis averted and order restored. What I'm proposing is a compromise, a way to work within the system while acknowledging its limitations. You'll have the authority to act when necessary, to implement techniques that don't exist in any official manual, to break the rules when following them would lead to disaster. Eliza set the tablet down carefully, her mind racing with the implications of what Walsh was offering. After 7 years of being sidelined, of having her expertise dismissed and her innovations buried, she was being offered the chance to step back into a role where she could make a genuine difference. Why now? She asked. If you recognized me 4 years ago when I was transferred here, why wait until today to make this offer? Walsh's expression grew more serious. Because I needed to be sure, not of your capabilities, I never doubted those, but of your judgment, your restraint. He leaned forward again, his eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. The analyst who breaks the rules only when absolutely necessary is precisely the kind of person I want leading this division. Someone who understands the value of protocol, but isn't blinded by it. Someone who can navigate the gray areas where rigid adherence to rules becomes dangerous. Eliza considered his words carefully, understanding the subtle test she had unknowingly passed. For 4 years, she had followed the rules, filed her reports, and maintained her cover as a simple analyst. She had observed but not intervened, analyzed but not acted, until today, when the situation had become genuinely critical. This won't be easy, she said finally. The same institutional resistance that buried my work 7 years ago still exists. The same people who believe that following orders is always the right approach, regardless of the circumstances. That's why we need you, Walsh replied simply. Not despite your willingness to break the rules, but because of it. Because sometimes, Ms. Morgan, the most important orders are the ones we choose not to follow. As Eliza left Director Walsh's office an hour later, the weight of the past 7 years seemed to lift from her shoulders. She had spent so long being the quiet observer, the dismissed analyst whose expertise was ignored and whose innovations were buried. Now she had been given the chance to step back into a role where her unique perspective was valued rather than suppressed. The corridor outside felt different somehow, though nothing had physically changed. The same institutional lighting, the same polished floors, the same security checkpoints that she had navigated every day for 4 years. But her relationship to this space, to this facility, had fundamentally transformed. Tomorrow she would begin building her new division, implementing training protocols, and documenting techniques that had been buried for too long. She would step back into the role she had always been meant to play, not just following orders, but questioning them, challenging them, and when necessary, breaking them to protect the people and principles that mattered most. As she walked through the facility that had been her home for 4 years, Eliza Morgan smiled. Some rules existed to be followed, but others existed to be broken, and knowing the difference was perhaps the most important skill of all. 3 months after the atmospheric stabilization crisis, the newly established Crisis Response and Prevention Division occupied a dedicated section of Horizon Base's East Wing. What had once been underutilized storage space had been transformed into a modern command center with specialized monitoring systems and dedicated research stations. The space hummed with purposeful energy as scientists and technicians moved between workstations, their conversations a blend of theoretical discussion and practical implementation. Eliza Morgan stood at the center of it all, reviewing data on the main display wall. Her new uniform, dark blue with silver accents, carried the insignia of division leadership, a far cry from the standard gray she had worn as an analyst. The change in her appearance was matched by a transformation in how others perceived her. The dismissive glances and condescending tones had been replaced by respectful nods and attentive listening. "The simulation results are promising," said Dr. Patel, who had transferred to Eliza's division immediately after its formation. She gestured toward a series of readouts showing atmospheric stability patterns. "The modified counter-resonance technique is showing a 42% improvement in response time over traditional methods." Eliza nodded, studying the data with critical attention. "That's good, but we need to push for better. In a real crisis, every second matters." The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of activity as Eliza built her division from the ground up. She had hand-selected her team, choosing individuals who demonstrated not just technical expertise, but also adaptability and independent thinking. Some, like Dr. Patel, had witnessed her unorthodox approach firsthand during the crisis. Others had been recruited based on their reputation for questioning established protocols when circumstances demanded it. "We've scheduled a live demonstration for next week," Dr. Patel continued. "Director Walsh has invited representatives from 3 other research facilities to observe." "Including Northfield Station?" Eliza asked, already knowing the answer. Dr. Patel smiled. "Especially Northfield. Apparently, there's considerable interest in your methods from the very people who buried them 7 years ago." The irony wasn't lost on Eliza. The same officials who had classified her techniques and marginalized her career were now eager to see what she had developed. Success had a way of changing perspectives, of transforming the rule breaker into the innovator. "Dr. Morgan," called a voice from across the command center. Jason, the technician who had once dismissed her concern so casually, now approached with a tablet in hand. He had been one of the last additions to her team, his initial skepticism giving way to genuine respect after witnessing her handling of the crisis. "The atmospheric monitoring network is picking up unusual patterns in Sector 7, he reported, handing her the tablet. "Nothing critical yet, but the harmonics show similarities to what we observed before the stabilization field." Failure. Eliza studied the readings carefully. The patterns were subtle variations in atmospheric pressure and energy distribution that most monitoring systems would classify as background noise. But her trained eye recognized the precursors of potential instability. Increase monitoring frequency in that sector, she instructed. And prepare a preventative stabilization protocol. I want options ready before we need them. Jason nodded and moved away to implement her directions. There was no hint of the dismissive attitude he had shown 3 months ago, no suggestion that her concerns might be overblown. Experience had proven the value of her intuition, her ability to see patterns before they developed into crises. "You've built something remarkable here," came a voice from the entrance to the command center. Eliza turned to see Director Walsh standing in the doorway, observing the activity with evident satisfaction. He crossed the room to join her at the main display, his gaze taking in the sophisticated monitoring systems and specialized equipment that now filled the space. 3 months ago, this was just a concept, he said. Now it's changing how we approach atmospheric research across the entire network. Eliza allowed herself a small smile of acknowledgement. We still have a long way to go. Institutional resistance doesn't disappear overnight, no matter how convincing the results. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. True change takes time. But what you've accomplished here goes beyond new techniques or improved response times. You're changing the culture, showing that following orders blindly isn't always the path to success. He gestured toward the team members moving purposefully around the command center. These people have learned that sometimes the most valuable contribution comes from questioning established procedures, from being willing to break the rules when the situation demands it. Eliza watched her team with a sense of pride. Each person had been selected not just for their technical skills, but for their willingness to think independently, to challenge assumptions when necessary. They were being trained not just in atmospheric science but in a new approach to crisis management, one that valued adaptation over rigid adherence to protocol. We've received the final approval for the training program, Walsh continued. Starting next month, your division will host specialists from 12 other facilities for intensive instruction in your methods. The news sent a surge of satisfaction. Through Eliza, the training program had been her idea, a way to disseminate her techniques beyond Horizon Base, to ensure that other facilities would be prepared for the kind of crisis that had nearly destroyed Northfield Station 7 years ago. Have they approved the full curriculum? She asked, including the sections on protocol override authorization. Walsh's expression turned wry. Let's just say there was considerable debate about that particular module. Some administrators feel that teaching people when to break the rules might encourage them to break them unnecessarily. And your response? That people who understand why the rules exist are better equipped to know when they should be broken, he replied. The curriculum was approved as submitted. Your trainees will learn not just how to implement your techniques, but when to implement them, even if it means going against established protocol. Before Eliza could respond, an alert sounded from the main monitoring station. The atmospheric patterns in Sector 7 had shifted, intensifying beyond the parameters of normal fluctuation. Not yet a crisis, but a situation that demanded attention. I need to address this, she said, already moving toward the station where Jason was analyzing the incoming data. Walsh nodded. This is exactly why your division exists, Dr. Morgan. I'll leave you to it. As the director left the command center, Eliza joined Jason at the monitoring station. The display showed a developing pattern of atmospheric instability, nothing as severe as the crisis 3 months ago, but significant enough to warrant immediate attention. Conventional analysis would classify this as a minor anomaly, Jason said, pointing to the readings. Standard protocol would call for basic monitoring with no intervention unless the situation escalates. Eliza studied the patterns carefully, recognizing the subtle indicators that suggested a more complex situation than standard metrics would indicate. 3 months ago, such indicators had been dismissed until they developed into a full-blown crisis. Today, they were being identified and addressed before they could become dangerous. Implement a preemptive stabilization sequence, she decided. Low-level counter-resonance to disrupt the harmonic buildup before it can intensify. Jason looked up with a slight frown. That's outside standard protocol for this level of anomaly. The official procedure is— I know what the official procedure is, Eliza interrupted gently. And I'm authorizing a deviation from that procedure based on pattern recognition and risk assessment. Understanding dawned in Jason's expression. This was precisely the kind of situation they had discussed in training, where rigid adherence to protocol might allow a manageable situation to develop into a genuine crisis. The decision to act preemptively, to break from standard procedure, was exactly the kind of judgment call that defined Eliza's approach to crisis management. Implementing preemptive stabilization, he confirmed, his fingers moving across the controls with practiced efficiency. Counter-resonance pattern Alpha 7. Eliza watched as the stabilization sequence took effect. Subtle energy pulses targeting the specific harmonics that were showing signs of instability. The intervention was gentle, almost surgical in its precision, not the brute force approach that standard protocols would have employed if the situation had been allowed to escalate. Within minutes, the atmospheric readings began to normalize. The potentially dangerous harmonics dissipated, leaving behind stable patterns that no longer presented any risk. A crisis had been averted not through emergency response, but through preemptive action based on experience and intuition. Log the intervention and outcomes, Eliza instructed. I want a complete analysis of the effectiveness of our approach, compared to standard protocols. As Jason documented the incident, Dr. Patel approached with a thoughtful expression. That's the third time this month we've implemented preemptive measures against standard protocol, she observed. Each time, we've prevented a situation that might have escalated if we'd followed conventional procedures. Eliza nodded. That's the point of this division. Not just to respond when crises occur, but to prevent them from occurring in the first place, even when that means breaking from established procedures. The data will be compelling, Dr. Patel agreed. 3 successful interventions with minimal resource expenditure, compared to the potential costs of full-scale crisis response. Numbers matter, Eliza acknowledged. But what matters more is changing how people think about crisis management. Teaching them to recognize when following the rules might be more dangerous than breaking them. As the afternoon progressed, Eliza moved through her division, consulting with team members, reviewing research projects, and fine-tuning the training curriculum for the upcoming program. The space that had once been empty storage now vibrated with purpose and innovation, a physical manifestation of the transformation in her professional life. At her personal workstation, she paused to review a message that had arrived from Northfield Station. Dr. Lena Wright, the current director, was requesting a preliminary briefing before the official demonstration. 7 years ago, Wright had been one of the administrators who had approved Eliza's reassignment after the crisis. Now she was reaching out personally, her message carrying a note of professional respect that would have been unimaginable in the aftermath of that incident. Times change, Eliza thought as she composed a response. People change when given enough evidence and incentive. As she finished her reply, a notification appeared on her screen. An incoming transmission from a research vessel operating in the Arctic Circle, marked urgent. Eliza accepted the call, and the screen filled with the image of a woman in an expedition parka, her expression tense despite the poor connection. Dr. Morgan, the woman began, her voice breaking up slightly over the connection. This is Dr. Sarah Chun from the Arctic research vessel Polaris. We've been monitoring unusual atmospheric conditions in our region for the past 72 hours. Our standard analysis protocols classify them as natural variations, but your instincts tell you otherwise. Eliza finished for her. Dr. Chun's expression registered surprise, then relief. Yes, there's something about the pattern that doesn't match natural phenomena. I've been reviewing your published papers on harmonic resonance and atmospheric disturbances, and I believe we may be observing early stages of a similar event. Eliza felt a surge of both concern and validation. Her research was being read and applied beyond horizon base, leading others to question standard protocols when their observations suggested a different approach. "Send me your raw data," she instructed. "All atmospheric readings for the past week, not just the ones flagged by standard monitoring protocols." As Dr. Chun transmitted the information, Eliza opened a secure channel to Director Walsh's office. This was precisely the kind of situation they had established protocols for potential crisis development at remote locations where standard procedures might be inadequate. "Director," she said when Walsh appeared on screen, "we have a situation developing in the Arctic Circle. The research vessel Polaris is reporting atmospheric anomalies that may indicate early-stage harmonic resonance." Walsh's expression turned serious. "Similar to what we experienced here?" "Potentially," Eliza confirmed. "I'm analyzing their data now, but initial patterns suggest comparable harmonic structures, though still in very early development." Walsh didn't hesitate. "What do you need?" "Authorization for remote intervention," Eliza replied, "and possibly emergency deployment of a response team if the situation escalates." Under standard protocols, such authorization would require multiple levels of approval, risk assessment committees, and hours if not days of bureaucratic process. But the Crisis Response Division operated under different parameters, with streamlined authority structures designed specifically for situations where delay might prove catastrophic. "You have full authorization," Walsh said immediately. "Keep me updated on developments." As the connection closed, Eliza turned her attention to the incoming data from the Polaris. The atmospheric readings showed subtle but distinctive patterns, harmonic resonances that standard monitoring systems would classify as background variation, but that her trained eye recognized as potential precursors to a more serious disturbance. "Dr. Patel Jason," she called, bringing up the data on the main display. "I need your analysis on these readings from the Arctic research vessel." Her team gathered quickly, studying the information with the focused attention that had become their hallmark. No dismissive assumptions, no rigid adherence to standard classifications, just careful observation and independent assessment. "The harmonic structure is similar to what we observed in Sector 7 earlier today," Jason noted, "but with distinct variations that might indicate environmental influence rather than technological origin." Dr. Patel nodded in agreement. "The resonance pattern suggests natural formation, but with unusual amplification characteristics. Not something standard protocols would flag as concerning, but potentially dangerous if allowed to develop unchecked," Eliza concluded, "especially given the remote location and limited resources available to the research vessel." She made her decision quickly, balancing risk assessment against potential consequences. "Prepare a remote intervention package. We'll transmit counter-resonance protocols calibrated for their specific environmental conditions, along with implementation instructions for their technical team." As her team moved to implement her directions, Eliza opened a direct channel to Dr. Chen on the Polaris. The connection was stronger now, the scientist's face clearer on the screen. "Dr. Chun, we've analyzed your data and identified potential harmonic resonance patterns consistent with early-stage atmospheric disturbance," she explained. "We're preparing intervention protocols for immediate implementation." The relief on Chun's face was visible even through the digital connection. "Thank you. Our standard procedures would have us continue monitoring for at least 48 more hours before considering any active response." "Which might be 48 hours too late," Eliza replied. "Sometimes the rules need to be broken before they break us." Chun's expression registered surprise, then understanding. "That's why I contacted you directly. Your reputation for unconventional approaches preceded you." As they discussed implementation details, Eliza felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The work she was doing now extended far beyond Horizon Base, influencing how crisis management was approached across the entire research network. People like Dr. Chun were reaching out directly, bypassing conventional channels when their observations suggested that standard protocols might be inadequate. 3 hours later, the situation on the Polaris had been stabilized. The counter-resonance protocols had successfully disrupted the developing harmonic patterns, returning the atmospheric conditions to normal parameters without requiring emergency deployment of a response team. A potential crisis had been averted through early intervention, guided by experience rather than rigid procedure. As Eliza documented the incident for official records, she reflected on how much had changed in 3 months. The quiet analyst who had once been dismissed and ignored was now leading a specialized division, developing innovative approaches to crisis management, and training others to recognize when breaking the rules might be the only way to prevent disaster. The medallion she had carried for 7 years, the token of recognition from her original research team, now sat openly on her desk rather than hidden in her pocket. Its worn surface served as a reminder of both where she had come from and how far she had traveled since then. "Dr. Morgan," called a voice from the doorway of her office. Eliza looked up to see Jason standing there, tablet in hand. "Final analysis of the Arctic intervention is complete. The preemptive measures prevented what modeling suggests would have developed into a significant atmospheric disturbance within 72 hours. He handed her the tablet, and Eliza scrolled through the detailed assessment with satisfaction. The data was clear. Their unconventional approach had averted a crisis that standard protocols would have allowed to develop until emergency response was the only option. "Add this to the demonstration materials for next week," she instructed. "It's a perfect example of why we need to reconsider when and how we follow established procedures." As Jason left, Eliza turned her attention to the training curriculum she had been developing. The program would bring specialists from 12 different facilities to Horizon Base, where they would learn not just technical procedures, but a new philosophy of crisis management, one that valued informed judgment over blind obedience to protocol. The section titled Ethical Override Protocols had been the most controversial part of the curriculum, drawing resistance from administrators who worried about encouraging disobedience within the system. But Eliza had stood firm, insisting that teaching people when to break the rules was just as important as teaching them how to follow them. "The most dangerous person in a crisis," she had written in the introduction to that section, "is not the one who breaks the rules, but the one who follows them without understanding their purpose or recognizing their limitations." As she reviewed the material, Eliza heard a knock at her office door. Looking up, she was surprised to see Dr. Harrington, the physicist who had been so dismissive of her warnings before the crisis 3 months ago. He had not joined her division, choosing instead to remain with the primary research team, and they had had minimal interaction since the incident. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his tone formal but not unfriendly. "Do you have a moment?" Eliza gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Of course. What can I do for you?" Harrington sat down, his posture suggesting discomfort despite his professional demeanor. "I've been reviewing your training curriculum for the upcoming program," he said. "Particularly the section on protocol override authorization." Eliza tensed slightly, expecting criticism or objection. Harrington had always been a strict adherent to established procedures, uncomfortable with approaches that deviated from official protocols. "I'd like to request permission to attend the training sessions," he continued, surprising her. Not as an instructor, obviously, but as a participant. The request was unexpected. Harrington was a senior researcher with decades of experience, not the typical candidate for a training program designed primarily for mid-level specialists. "May I ask why?" Eliza inquired carefully. Harrington was silent for a moment, as if considering his response. 3 months ago, I dismissed your concerns because they didn't align with established protocols, he said finally. I was so focused on following the rules that I couldn't see the danger right in front of me. If you hadn't broken those rules, we might not be having this conversation. The admission clearly cost him something in professional pride, but his expression remained resolute. I've spent my entire career believing that protocols exist for a reason, that following them is always the safest approach, he continued. But what happened that day challenged everything I thought I knew about crisis management. I need to understand better, not just the technical aspects of your methods, but the judgment behind when to implement them. Eliza studied him thoughtfully. This was precisely the kind of transformation she had hoped to inspire, not just in the younger specialists who would form the next generation of researchers, but in the established scientists whose adherence to protocol had become reflexive rather than reflective. The training program starts next Monday, she said. I'll add you to the roster myself. Relief and gratitude flickered across Harrington's face. Thank you. I know I haven't always been the most receptive to unconventional approaches. That's exactly why your participation matters, Eliza replied. This isn't about rejecting protocols or encouraging reckless behavior. It's about understanding when following the rules might be more dangerous than breaking them. And that understanding comes from experience, sometimes painfully acquired. As Harrington left her office, Eliza turned back to the curriculum with renewed purpose. The transformation she was witnessing, not just in herself, but in people like Harrington who had once embodied the rigid adherence to protocol that had nearly led to disaster, represented the real success of her division. Not the advanced techniques or improved response times, but the fundamental shift in how people approached crisis situations. The recognition that sometimes the most important order was the one you chose not to follow. The demonstration hall at Horizon Base had been transformed from a standard research space into something resembling a small conference center. Rows of comfortable chairs faced a raised platform where sophisticated monitoring equipment displayed real-time atmospheric data. Representatives from 12 different research facilities filled the room, their attentive expressions focused on the woman standing confidently at the center of the stage. Eliza Morgan moved with practiced ease as she guided the audience through the final segment of her presentation. No longer the dismissed analyst with the basic clearance badge, she commanded this space with the natural authority of someone who had earned her position through proven results rather than institutional politics. The counter-resonance technique isn't just about technology, she explained, gesturing toward the simulation playing on the main screen. It's about recognizing patterns before they become crises, about trusting your instincts when standard metrics tell you everything is fine. In the front row, Director Walsh nodded slightly, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Beside him sat Dr. Lena Wright from Northfield Station, the very facility where Eliza's techniques had first been developed and subsequently buried. 7 years ago, Wright had signed the reassignment order that removed Eliza from active research. Today, she watched with undisguised interest as those same techniques were being officially presented to the scientific community. What truly sets our approach apart, Eliza continued, is not the technical implementation, but the decision-making framework. Knowing when to follow established protocols and when to override them is the difference between crisis management and crisis prevention. She moved to the next slide, which displayed a decision matrix titled Ethical Override Protocols. This had been the most controversial element of her training program, drawing resistance from administrators who worried about encouraging disobedience within structured systems. The most dangerous words in crisis management are "that's not the procedure," Eliza said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Procedures exist for a reason, and they serve us well in predictable situations. But when we face unpredictable threats, rigid adherence to protocol can become more dangerous than thoughtful deviation. In the second row, Dr. Harrington once. Her most vocal critic was taking detailed notes. His participation in the training program had surprised many of his colleagues, who had known him as a strict adherent to established procedures. Yet here he was, earnestly studying approaches that challenged everything he had previously believed about crisis management. 6 months ago, Eliza said, shifting to a more personal tone, I was an environmental analyst with Level 2 clearance. My job was to monitor atmospheric conditions and file reports. To observe but not intervene. To analyze but not act. The room grew quieter as the audience recognized the shift toward personal testimony. Many had heard rumors about Eliza's background, about how she had been relegated to a minor analytical role despite her expertise, about how she had saved Horizon Base by breaking virtually every protocol in the emergency response manual. When I identified harmonic interference patterns in the atmospheric stabilization test, standard procedure would have had me log the observation and forward it to the appropriate department for review. Following that procedure would have resulted in a catastrophic breach and potential loss of life. Eliza paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the audience. Then she smiled, her expression warming. Instead, I chose to break the rules. To speak up when I was expected to stay silent. To act when I was authorized only to observe. And in doing so, I prevented a disaster that established protocols were inadequate to address. She gestured toward the demonstration team positioned at monitoring stations around the stage. Today, we're going to show you exactly how that decision process works in real time. Not just the technical implementation of counter-resonance techniques, but the critical judgment calls that determine when standard procedures should be set aside in favor of more effective approaches. For the next hour, Eliza and her team guided the audience through a series of increasingly complex simulations. Each scenario began with subtle indicators that standard monitoring systems would classify as normal variations. As the simulations progressed, those indicators developed into patterns that suggested potential instability, not yet at crisis levels, but concerning to trained observers. At each decision point, Eliza explained the standard protocols that would typically guide response actions. Then she demonstrated how her team evaluated whether those protocols were adequate for the specific situation, or whether override procedures should be implemented. The key is informed judgment, she emphasized repeatedly. Not arbitrary rule breaking, but deliberate decisions based on pattern recognition and risk assessment. We don't disregard protocols because we think we know better. We override them when specific indicators suggest they might be inadequate for the situation at hand. The final simulation was based directly on the crisis that had occurred at Horizon Base 6 months earlier. As the atmospheric disturbance within the virtual testing chamber began to develop the characteristic hexagonal pattern, Eliza turned to the audience with a challenging expression. Standard protocols would classify this as a containable anomaly, requiring continuous monitoring but no direct intervention, she said. Based on what you've learned today, what would your response be? The room fell silent as the representatives considered the data displayed on the main screen. Then, from the second row, Dr. Harrington stood up. The harmonic patterns indicate potential cascade failure, he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned a difficult lesson firsthand. Standard containment protocols would be ineffective against this type of disturbance. I would implement counter-resonance measures immediately, even though that represents a deviation from established procedure. Eliza nodded, a smile of genuine approval lighting her face. Exactly. And 6 months ago, you would have made a very different call. Harrington acknowledged the point with a rueful nod. 6 months ago, I was so focused on following procedures that I couldn't see the danger right in front of me. It took watching someone break the rules to save all our lives for me to understand that sometimes the rulebook is the problem, not the solution. His honest admission sent a ripple of murmured conversation through the audience. Many of the Representatives came from facilities with rigid hierarchical structures, where deviation from protocol was treated as a disciplinary issue rather than a potential necessity. "This is the real purpose of our training program," Eliza said, bringing the focus back to the front of the room. "Not just to teach you technical procedures, but to help you develop the judgment to know when those procedures might lead you astray, to recognize when following orders might be more dangerous than breaking them." As the formal presentation concluded and the audience broke into smaller discussion groups, Director Walsh approached Eliza at the edge of the stage. "You've made quite an impression," he said, gesturing toward the animated conversations taking place throughout the room, "especially on our visitors from Northfield." Eliza glanced toward Dr. Wright, who was engaged in intense discussion with representatives from 3 other facilities. "7 years is a long time," she observed. "Long enough for perspectives to change if given sufficient reason." Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "The data from your division's first 6 months is compelling. 3 major incidents prevented through early intervention, numerous minor anomalies addressed before they could develop into serious threats, and all with significantly reduced resource expenditure compared to traditional crisis response." "Numbers matter," Eliza acknowledged. "But what matters more is changing how people think about crisis management, teaching them to recognize when rigid adherence to protocol might be more dangerous than thoughtful deviation." Before Walsh could respond, Dr. Wright approached, her expression thoughtful. 7 years ago, she had been part of the administration that had classified Eliza's techniques and reassigned her to an analytical position. Today, she extended her hand with professional respect. "Dr. Morgan," she said as they shook hands, "your presentation was illuminating, particularly the decision matrix for protocol override authorization." Eliza accepted the comment with a gracious nod. "Thank you. It's been the most controversial aspect of our approach, but also the most essential." Wright's expression turned more serious. 7 years ago, we made a decision at Northfield that I've had cause to reconsider many times since. We were so concerned about maintaining procedural discipline that we buried techniques that could have prevented numerous incidents in the intervening years. The admission was clearly difficult for her, a tacit acknowledgement of an institutional failure that had potentially serious consequences. "We'd like to implement your training program at Northfield," Wright continued. "Not just the technical aspects, but the full curriculum, including the sections on ethical override protocols." The request represented a complete reversal of the position Northfield had taken 7 years ago. Then, they had deemed Eliza's techniques too dangerous precisely because they operated outside established protocols. Now they were seeking to implement those same techniques, including the framework for determining when protocols should be overridden. "We'd be happy to assist with implementation," Eliza replied, careful to keep any hint of vindication from her voice. This wasn't about personal satisfaction, but about ensuring that critical safety techniques were available to those who needed them. As Wright moved away to rejoin her colleagues, Walsh gave Eliza a knowing look. "Full circle," he said quietly. Eliza smiled. "Not quite. A full circle would put us back where we started. This is more like an upward spiral returning to similar questions, but with greater understanding and better solutions." The afternoon session transitioned into practical workshops, with representatives breaking into smaller groups to work through specific scenarios under the guidance of Eliza's team. In one corner of the demonstration hall, Dr. Patel led a group through atmospheric monitoring exercises, teaching them to recognize subtle patterns that standard systems might classify as normal variations. In another area, Jason guided participants through the technical implementation of counter-resonance protocols, emphasizing the adjustments needed for different environmental conditions. His confidence as an instructor was a far cry from the dismissive technician who had mocked Eliza's concerns 6 months earlier. Eliza moved between the groups, observing the interactions and providing guidance where needed. The transformation she was witnessing, not just in her own career, but in how her techniques were being received by the wider scientific community, filled her with a sense of purpose that had been absent during her years as a sidelined analyst. As the day's activities wound down and representatives began to disperse toward the dining facility, Eliza remained in the demonstration hall, reviewing data from the simulations and making notes for the next day's sessions. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't immediately notice Dr. Wright's return until the older woman cleared her throat softly. "Dr. Morgan, do you have a moment for a more private conversation?" Eliza set aside her tablet. "Of course. Would you prefer to use my office?" Wright nodded, and they walked together through the corridors of Horizon Base toward the Crisis Response Division's dedicated section. The journey was conducted in thoughtful silence, each woman considering her words carefully. When they reached Eliza's office, a space that reflected her current status with its panoramic windows and advanced technical systems, Wright took a seat across from the desk with an expression of someone preparing to address a difficult topic. "7 years ago, I signed the order that removed you from active research at Northfield," she began without preamble. "At the time, I believed it was the right decision. Your actions during the atmospheric disturbance saved lives, but they also represented a dangerous precedent, a researcher acting without authorization, implementing untested techniques without going through proper approval channels." Eliza listened without interrupting, her expression neutral despite the surge of emotions that accompanied any reference to that pivotal moment in her career. "What I didn't understand then," Wright continued, "was that our approval channels were part of the problem. Our insistence on following established protocols, even when they were clearly inadequate, our preference for orderly procedure over effective response, our institutional resistance to innovation that challenged our assumptions." She sighed, her expression carrying the weight of retrospection. "We were so concerned about maintaining the integrity of our procedural systems that we failed to consider whether those systems were actually serving their intended purpose, keeping people safe and advancing scientific understanding." The admission was clearly difficult for Wright, representing as it did an acknowledgement of serious misjudgment on her part and on the part of the institution she led. "The past 7 years have seen 3 major incidents at Northfield that might have been prevented or mitigated if we had implemented your techniques," she said. "In each case, our researchers followed established protocols exactly as they were trained to do. And in each case, those protocols proved inadequate for the specific situation at hand." Eliza nodded slowly. "That's the fundamental challenge of crisis management. Protocols are designed for anticipated scenarios, but the most dangerous situations are often those we haven't fully anticipated. Which is precisely why we need people who are willing to break the rules when circumstances demand it," Wright agreed. "People with the judgment to recognize when established procedures might lead to disaster rather than prevention." She leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "I'd like to offer you a formal apology, Dr. Morgan, both personally and on behalf of Northfield Station. The decision to remove you from active research and to classify your techniques was a mistake, one that had consequences far beyond your individual career. The apology was unexpected, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing from an institution that had fundamentally altered the course of Eliza's professional life." For a moment, she was unsure how to respond, the vindication she had long sought suddenly real and tangible. "I appreciate that, Dr. Wright," she said finally. "But what matters now isn't what happened 7 years ago. It's ensuring that the techniques I developed are available to those who need them, that researchers are trained not just in how to follow protocols, but in when those protocols might need to be set aside." Wright nodded, relief evident in her expression. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say. Because I have a proposal that goes beyond implementing your training program at Northfield." She reached into her briefcase and removed a tablet, activating a display that projected between them. The document that appeared was a formal proposal for a network-wide initiative titled Adaptive Crisis Response Protocols. "We'd like you to lead the development of a comprehensive framework for crisis management across all research facilities," Wright explained. "Not just implementing your specific techniques, but establishing a new approach to protocol development and implementation, one that builds in the flexibility for informed deviation when circumstances require it." Eliza studied the proposal with growing amazement. What Wright was suggesting went far beyond technical training or even philosophical approach. It represented a fundamental restructuring of how crisis management was conceptualized and implemented throughout the entire research network. This would require buy-in from every facility director, she observed, many of whom have built their careers on strict procedural adherence. Wright smiled slightly. 6 months ago, that would have been an insurmountable obstacle. But the results from your division have provided compelling evidence that there's a better way. When presented with data showing significantly improved outcomes and reduced resource expenditure, even the most tradition-bound administrators become open to new approaches. She gestured toward the proposal still displayed between them. "This initiative has already received preliminary approval from the network's central administration. They're prepared to establish a dedicated development team with you as the lead, REPORTING directly to the Oversight Committee rather than through traditional administrative channels." The implications were enormous. Instead of working to change perspectives one facility at a time, Eliza would have the opportunity to reshape crisis management protocols across the entire network to ensure that the lessons she had learned, both in her original research and during her years as a sidelined analyst, would inform how future crises were addressed at every level. "This isn't about individual techniques or specific scenarios," Wright continued. "It's about embedding a new philosophy into the foundation of our approach to crisis management, teaching people not just what to do, but how to think about what they're doing, how to evaluate when established procedures serve their intended purpose, and when they become obstacles to effective response." Eliza considered the proposal carefully, recognizing both its potential and its challenges. What Wright was suggesting would face resistance from many quarters, requiring her to navigate complex institutional politics while maintaining the integrity of her core approach. "It won't be easy," she said finally. "Changing institutional culture never is, especially when that culture is built around following established procedures without question." Wright nodded in acknowledgement. "Which is precisely why you're the right person to lead this initiative. You've already demonstrated that effective crisis management isn't about blind obedience to protocol, but about informed judgment and the courage to act when others hesitate." As their meeting concluded and Wright departed with Eliza's preliminary agreement to consider the proposal, the office fell into contemplative silence. Through the panoramic windows, Eliza could see the research complex stretching into the distance, its buildings and equipment representing the cutting edge of atmospheric science. 7 years ago, she had been removed from active research because she had broken the rules to save lives. She had spent 4 years as a sidelined analyst, observing but not intervening, analyzing but not acting. Then, when crisis struck horizon base, she had broken the rules again, and in doing so, had not only saved the facility, but had transformed how crisis management was approached throughout the research network. Now she was being offered the chance to formalize that transformation, to ensure that future researchers wouldn't face the same institutional resistance she had encountered, that they would be trained not just in technical procedures but in the critical judgment needed to know when those procedures should be set aside. The medallion that had once been hidden in her pocket now sat prominently on her desk, its surface worn smooth from years of habitual touching. It represented both where she had come from and how far she had traveled from dismissed analyst to division leader to potentially reshaping crisis management protocols across the entire scientific community. As Eliza prepared to leave for the day, she noticed Dr. Harrington standing in the doorway of her office, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. "Not just for the training program, but for what you did 6 months ago when the rest of us were too focused on following procedures to see the danger." Eliza smiled. "You've come a long way from dismissing my concerns about harmonic interference patterns." Harrington nodded, a rueful acknowledgement of his previous attitude. "I've spent my entire career believing that the rules existed to keep us safe, that following proper procedures was always the right approach, regardless of the circumstances." He gestured toward the training materials still displayed on Eliza's tablet. "What you've taught me, what you've taught all of us, is that the purpose of rules isn't to be followed blindly, but to serve as guides that help us make better decisions. And sometimes, the best decision is to break those rules for the right reasons." As he left, Eliza gathered her belongings and prepared to head to her quarters. The day had been intense, filled with presentations, discussions, and the unexpected proposal from Dr. Wright. But beneath the physical tiredness, she felt a profound sense of purpose and validation. She had transformed from the quiet analyst, who had accepted her diminished role, to someone who was actively reshaping how an entire scientific community approached crisis management. Not through institutional authority or political maneuvering, but through demonstrated results and unwavering commitment to a simple principle, that sometimes following orders was more dangerous than breaking them. As she walked through the corridors of Horizon Base, nodding to colleagues and training participants, Eliza Morgan reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The crisis at Northfield that had ended her original research career. The years of quiet observation as an environmental analyst. The atmospheric disturbance at Horizon Base that had provided the opportunity to prove her methods. The establishment of the Crisis Response Division and the successful implementation of her techniques. Each step had been necessary. Each challenge had provided lessons that informed her current approach. Even the years of being dismissed and sidelined had given her insights that she might not have gained through a more conventional career path. Insights about institutional blind spots, about the dangers of rigid hierarchies, about the critical importance of independent judgment in crisis situations. The research complex hummed with activity around her, scientists and technicians moving purposefully between laboratories and monitoring stations. But unlike 6 months ago, many now nodded to her with respect, acknowledging not just her current position but the expertise and courage that had earned it. Tomorrow would bring the second day of the training program. More simulations and discussions, more opportunities to share the approaches she had developed. Beyond that lay the potential network-wide initiative proposed by Dr. Wright, the chance to reshape crisis management protocols at a fundamental level. But for now, Eliza was content with what she had already accomplished, not just in terms of her own career, but in changing how others approached their responsibilities. In teaching them that sometimes the most important order was the one you chose not to follow. As she reached the residential wing of the facility, Eliza passed a group of young researchers engaged in animated discussion about the day's training sessions. Their enthusiasm was palpable, their minds clearly grappling with the implications of what they had learned. "It changes everything," one was saying. "Not just the technical procedures, but how we think about our entire approach to crisis management." Another nodded emphatically. "It's about having the courage to trust your judgment, even when that means going against established protocols. Especially," added a third, "when following those protocols might lead to disaster." Eliza smiled as she continued past them, her steps lighter despite the day's exhaustion. This was the real measure of her success, not awards or recognition or formal positions, but the transformation she was witnessing in how people approach their responsibilities. The recognition that sometimes Breaking the rules wasn't an act of defiance, but an act of courage and commitment to a higher purpose. The quiet analyst who had once been dismissed and ignored had become a catalyst for fundamental change, not through rebellion or confrontation, but through demonstrated results and unwavering adherence to a simple truth, that the purpose of rules was to serve people, not the other way around. And when those rules failed to serve their purpose, when they became obstacles rather than safeguards, the truly responsible choice wasn't blind obedience, but thoughtful deviation guided by expertise and commitment, preventing harm. As Eliza reached her quarters and the door closed behind her, she felt the weight of the day's activities settle into a deep sense of accomplishment. She had been just following orders until she saved everyone by breaking them. And in doing so, she had not only changed her own life, but had begun to transform an entire approach to crisis management. Sometimes the most important rules were the ones you had the courage to break. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.